Hey y'all, coming to you from Jacksonville, Florida, this is GovLove, a podcast about local government, brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, I'm a manager at Telus and a GovLove co-host. We've got a great episode for you today. We're going to be talking climate and heat mitigation in Tempe. But first, the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. Engaging local government leaders is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government. So your membership helps support this podcast. So if you love this content and want to keep hearing it, go become a member today. You can also give GovLove a follow on LinkedIn. We've got a page there where we're posting our latest episodes. So that's the best place to connect with us and other GovLove listeners. So now let me introduce today's guest. Brianne Fisher is the Climate Action Manager for the City of Tempe, a position she's been in since 2022. And previously she served as a mayoral aide for the city for about 4 years and has held positions for the state of Arizona, Center for Policy Informatics, and the Greater Phoenix Chamber of Commerce. Brianne, welcome to GovLove. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm excited for this conversation today. But we have a tradition on the podcast to start with a lightning round to get to know our guests a little bit. So my first question for you is, what book are you currently reading?
It is called First Lie Wins. It is fiction. I like to escape reality sometimes.
Yeah. That's fair.
Yeah.
Understandable. Very cool. All right. My next lightning round question for you. Cake or pie?
Pie with ice cream.
Oh, okay. That's a good caveat.
It's an important
I like
one.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What kind of pie?
Any, I think. Mixed berry. My sister makes a killer apple pie. My hometown, we live near an orchard, so the fresh apples and a fresh baked apple pie with ice cream is really, really hard to beat.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good choice. With the ice cream, it's hard to beat.
Important.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, next lightning round question for you. What is the first concert that you went to?
The first concert I went to was Backstreet Boys.
Nice.
That's right. I had my homemade choker necklace on with beads. My two older sisters there. Again, I grew up in a small town, so we came to Phoenix for this, which was a big deal. So yeah, quite memorable. I had sponge rollers in my hair for curly hair the next day, right? We did it. We did it all. Big deal. Backstreet Boys. Awesome.
That's great. I'm jealous. That's a
I would go back to another Backstreet Boys concert just for, the nostalgia.
Yeah. Agreed. All right. Then my last lightning round question for you. Where do you go for inspiration?
Outside.
Yeah.
I don't know if it matters where outside necessarily, but running outside is really good for me. It helps me breathe, and breathing helps me listen to myself, and that sometimes is the best inspiration I can have. Grounding, right? Walking at the park with your shoes off, just slowing down and breathing is what outside does for me. And so I think I am my own inspiration sometimes. You just need to cancel out the noise and listen to your gut and organize things in your brain a little bit, and going outside helps me do that. So I think I go outside for inspiration.
Yeah. No, yeah, I love that. And I can relate to that. Sometimes if it's been too long since I've been on a hike, it's there's something itchy, I gotta.
Totally. And again, the breathing, I became a runner a while ago, and it's the best form of forced meditation you can have.
Yes.
Right? Counting breaths, inhale and exhale, and the clarity that you get and the ideas that you get is pretty amazing. So, and I don't like to run on a treadmill inside. That is
it's the worst.
Not,
it's torture. Yeah.
It is torture. Where it's running outside can be inspirational and blissful, and running inside is just torture.
Yeah. No, I relate to that. Yeah. And then I love asking folks that come on the podcast their path to this field and to their position. So I know I gave a little bit of a intro of some of the positions you've held, but kind of from your perspective, what was your path to local government? What led you to the position you're in today?
Yeah, so I really think it began at home. sitting around the dinner table. My mom was in local government. She worked for the city of Safford, again, this small town that I'm from,
Mhm.
southeast of Arizona. And she was in human resources. And, we would have really interesting, complex discussions all about, local government. And I think that led me to choose my educational path, which was in, public service and public policy. I got my master's in public policy. And so from there, I kind of always knew I was going to be working in some level of government or government adjacent. I did an internship at the state capitol my last year of my master's program, and really learned a lot. Really also learned that I don't want to work at the
Yeah.
state capitol.
Yes. Yes.
They really have to walk a tight rope, and there just wasn't enough creativity
Mm.
for me in that space. Learned a lot, really valuable experience, but I wanted something a little bit more creative and fun and in touch with the people. I obviously went to school at Arizona State University, so was in Tempe, and grew to love the city, grew to know the city pretty well after 6 years. And when I was done with my state capitol experience, I started applying at different jobs and applied for the mayor's aide role at the city of
Mhm.
Tempe. And they didn't know me from anybody, but I was selected for that position, which I'm extraordinarily grateful for, that they took a chance on somebody that they didn't really know to serve in that role. And um, started to just absolutely love watching how government was done at
Mm.
the top, right?
Mhm.
How everything that I read in a book and studied in a book of what the policy development analysis
Yeah.
evaluation process was, and then what the reality of how policy was made, and the gaps and the differences of that. It
Yeah.
was such a cool perspective being in the mayor's office for about 4 years, and working with two different mayors,
Hmm.
which was also an interesting experience to just see the difference in leadership and how that shifted with the different elected official in the office. Um, and so when the position opened up it was the second position in the sustainability department, and I was a little done thinking about the politics of things. I was like, okay, I get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to go back to what I went to school for and more of this true policy development phase of things, right? Being
Mhm.
being in the weeds of things, and creating programs and policies that can shape behavior and the built environment.
Yeah.
So I was, again, very lucky to, I think, get the position. I think that I was the right person at the right time, which is usually what it comes down to.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, More so than you could have all the skill set in the world, and maybe you're just not the right person at the right time for that position. And I was. I think my boss at the time, the director, the only employee of the sustainability department, was a PhD in sustainability. One is the first who got their degrees at ASU, and I think was looking for a second person that understood the politics, had relationships, knew how to navigate the city
Mm.
more so than they needed somebody who was an expert in sustainability, and knew that I could grow into that. So that's kind of where I'm at now. We now have a staff of 7 folks.
Oh wow. Yeah.
I have a new director. The one that hired me is now working in the governor's office in California. Um, and we are no longer a standalone department. We recently merged with the transportation department, and we can talk about the pros and cons of that. So I have a director above me. I'm the climate action manager, and then I've got 7 folks underneath me now. So we've come a long way.
Yeah, that's a big group. That's great.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Uh, and I am curious about that, structural move. But maybe for our listeners that haven't been to Tempe, can you give them a sense of maybe a little bit about the city? You mentioned obviously it's the home of ASU, but maybe what are some maybe for this conversation? What are some of the specific climate challenges that Tempe faces that are obviously going to inform your group's work?
Yeah, Tempe is, if you've never been, it's a super fun, funky city that is, a suburb of the metropolitan Phoenix area. We are landlocked, so we've got cities all around us,
Mhm.
which is helpful in thinking about density and transportation oriented development, but also a challenge because not everybody takes
Yeah, yeah.
public transportation and they drive through the city, or they are driving in and around. We're always getting driven through, right? Or they're
Hmm.
or they're stopping here. So and we are a net importer of jobs. We have a big employee base. So our population is about 190,000. Some folks like to say that's our nighttime population, but our daytime population almost doubles
Oh
that.
wow. Yeah.
That's changed a little bit now with work from home and stuff, but pre-COVID, certainly our population doubled. If you think about it, the metro population is about 4.5 million.
Mm.
So we also hold a ton of special events at our Tempe Beach Park. We have a man-made lake that draws in a lot of tourism. It is the second most populated destination other than the Grand Canyon in the state.
Oh wow. Yeah.
So we see a lot of visitors. We see a lot of people coming into the city. So when we are thinking about our tax base and revenues, that is on our nighttime population, so to say, that 190, but really we are squished between the city of Phoenix and the city of Mesa, which are the two largest cities in this state. And so
Mm.
that adds a unique kind of challenge just with having large masses on our infrastructure and not
Mhm.
always having that big city budget to help with those things. So that's just a little bit of the kind of government picture. But
Yeah.
we've got 217 miles of bikeways. We do have a really robust transportation system. We have light rail, streetcar, and a free neighborhood circulator, which has been around forever.
Mm.
The city of Tempe has a really educated residential base. I think that there's like 45% of residents who hold a bachelor's degree or higher.
Oh wow. Yeah.
So that's a really educated population. And I think we benefit from that because the transit, residents have decided to tax themselves on transit.
Hmm.
And that happened in the 1997. So that's really been able to help us build all of that great infrastructure I just mentioned. That makes us really unique in the metropolitan area. And then the residents recently also taxed themselves for arts.
Oh cool.
Tempe has a history of being this creative, artistic place. And that hasn't gone away, which is pretty amazing. Our residents said, no, we absolutely want to make sure we have art programming for our youth, and we want to enjoy the arts as we grow in age here, and we want art everywhere along our streets and in private areas when new development comes on board. So it's a pretty unique, I think, two unique areas where residents have decided to tax themselves on.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah.
Um, yeah. As for the climate characterizations,
Yeah.
we're hot, right? We're hot as heck. um, so being landlocked means we have all the elements of urban heat island.
Yeah.
Concrete jungle is us. So 143 days at or above 100 degrees in
Oh
2024
my gosh.
is a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. What the little statistic that I really watch and really scares me is the overnight lows,
Yeah.
right? And that's just speaking to the urban heat island. I want us to be able to cool off at night. And I really think that that's where we have an opportunity to make some massive changes.
Mm.
That is really what I'm narrowing in on with my team, and trying to get others to play along with is we can change the overnight low. So
Oh,
again, in
interesting.
2024, 39 days with the overnight low being 90 degrees or higher.
Oh,
We
wow.
have not reached an overnight low that is 100, but we got really, really close last year. And and again, I think some of this is just because I grew up in a small town and I still have family in a small town, and like the smell and the stars and the way it cools down at night is so beautiful and
Mm.
so beneficial. And we can do that, right? It happens when you bike through a certain neighborhood, and everybody's experienced this, no matter what city you live in. But you bike through a certain neighborhood that has less hard surface, has
Mm-hmm.
more vegetation, and you feel the difference, right? You
Yeah.
purposefully take your bike through that route. We can create microclimates that can impact our larger climate. Um, that's that's my gonna try to be my claim to fame, right? Is
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
we can change the overnight low.
Okay. I love that. So, that was one thing, moving to Jacksonville, is that getting used to those high overnight lows is like, there's no break from the heat, and
Mm-hmm.
it makes it makes the summers so hard. So I guess, I'm curious, obviously that is a very difficult challenge. And, so you mentioned maybe some of the strategies. What are things that cities can do to is it just the urban heat island effect? And so it's thinking about green infrastructure, or what are some of the strategies y'all are pursuing to like get at that overnight, low? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so I am not a sustainability policy guru. I'm like somewhat learning all of this stuff, right? I
Yeah.
got my education in policy, so I understand people's behaviors. I understand the need to kind of test things out and develop things and have the data to back you up. But um, I think that in some ways it's challenging because I don't
Hmm.
have a sophisticated
Just, yeah.
education in
Yeah.
this stuff.
Yeah.
But sometimes I'm like, well, neither does our population, right?
Yeah.
So how can we make this make sense to folks?
Mm.
And so I really like to explain our division's work in, the mitigation. That's kind of the proactive work. Um, we are trying to proactively not create more pollution, right?
Hmm.
How are we getting single occupancy vehicles off the road? How are we working on shifting our energy resources to be more efficient or come from renewable sources, right? That's the proactive approach. That's the mitigation work. And then you have the adaptation work, which I always describe as a little bit more reactive, right? We're
Hmm.
already experiencing all of this hot temperature, all of this hot weather. How are we adapting to that? How are we still becoming happy, thriving, healthy residents given we have 143 days of 100 plus temperatures?
Yeah.
And so that's just kind of simply how I explain our work to folks who don't fully understand sustainability in the words of mitigation and adaptation. I'm sure your audience is fully aware of that.
Hmm.
But the work of the urban heat island, and I call it urban cooling, right?
Yeah.
So instead
Yeah.
of talking about the negative component of it, I'm like, no, we're creating urban cooling. We're creating
Yeah.
urban cooling. Is really in that adaptation work. And we are doing a lot of green stormwater infrastructure work, green
Hmm.
infrastructure work. And I think there is a benefit in being with the transportation department right now
Yeah.
because one of the things that holds on to the heat the most is asphalt.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's this really complementary relationship of looking at a street, maybe a street that we are hearing from residents has high speeds. It feels really dangerous. There's this openness to kind of shifting what that street looks like. So we work together with our traffic engineers and say, okay, can we remove some asphalt? Can we create some bulb outs, chicanes, traffic circles that includes some planter areas, some additional shade? Can we capture any water from the street? And what kind of traffic calming benefits come from these engineering solutions? So we have a couple of projects where we're working together in that way, and I'm working on calculating how much asphalt can you remove in a project like that,
Yeah.
and what is the difference in temperature can you feel during the day and at night. So we're doing that work, and again, thinking about not just let's plant trees where we have existing space to plant trees, but pushing
Mm.
what is possible in saying, oh, we can't plant trees anywhere here. Well, what if we took out some asphalt or some concrete? Then we could,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You're creating new spaces to do that work in.
Oh, okay. There's so much I want to follow up on. So I guess before I get to the transportation piece, the green infrastructure itself, like creating more natural spaces, more green areas within kind of the right of way, for lack of maybe a better word. Is there anything else to the green infrastructure, and or maybe even around the stormwater piece, or are there other elements to it that you guys are working on that besides that kind of like, hey, let's rather than just having a sewer grate, let's make
Yeah.
this more green and natural and slow some of that water
Yeah,
down.
certainly. So we have an urban forester at the City of Tempe. He is actually placed in the Parks Department,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously has funding and some programs doing some good things. And the City of Tempe operates on performance measures.
Mm-hmm.
So he's kind of the one responsible for our tree and shade canopy goal.
Mm-hmm.
And, my point in all of this is great. We can add more shade and trees to parks, but those are already our very cool areas of the city, right?
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah. It's like a hat on a hat at a certain point.
totally. I'm like, yes, great. Like, I love that shady tree at the park, and yes, I'll go there and I'll use it. But why don't we spread the love out a little bit? And if we're just looking at, municipal property to expand our shade canopy, we're limited, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what is the private sector and our single family, which we have the most of in Tempe?
Mm-hmm.
What is our strategies to work with those two property owners on expanding shade canopy? And so we've been working with the urban forester on a tree stewards program, grant funded, currently on hold, but a really beautiful strategy to educate residents. We're paying them stipends. We're offering additional education opportunities for them after the 8-week program. We're providing them the physical tools and resources to plant their trees and take care of trees and vegetation, but also, that education, right? So truly everything that they need to be good stewards of their own trees, and also work with their neighbors to make sure their trees, the maintenance of those trees and that shade and that benefit is kept up. One thing that we've heard in focus groups and doing our community outreach is that, yes, of course I want more vegetation on my property, but I physically cannot dig that hole, or I can't afford that maintenance, right? But you also have a lot of agency in neighborhoods. You have people that do want to do that work, especially in rentals. People
Yeah.
who are in rentals want to get their hands dirty, right? They're like, yes,
Yeah.
give
Yeah.
me the tree trimmer, give me the gloves, like, let me smell some soil. And so, how can we tap into that agency and help cover the needs of installation and maintenance? Well, really, it just takes education and empowerment. And so, that's really what this tree steward program is trying to do.
Awesome.
So
I love
that's
that. Oh,
addressing, expanding shade
yeah.
on Tempe property, but also in the areas that we need it most, and cover the most amount of square footage in Tempe.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. And having done some volunteer tree planting, those are big holes. So I understand why people would want
Yeah,
some help.
absolutely.
It's interesting. I'm glad I didn't ask about the structure thing until we had a little bit got into some of your work. Because at first I was like, that seems like an odd alignment of sustainability and transportation. But to your point about kind of the focus areas, like transportation has a huge role to play in mitigation. And if you're using kind of this right of way as a way to think about, especially addressing urban heat, like, and trying to bring down improve cooling, like the transportation again has like a big role to play. So I'm curious, like, how is that the restructure gone, and like how are you guys kind of working together with transportation now, and maybe is it and how do you guys kind of approach like adding sustainability elements to some of their projects or some of the work that they're already doing?
Yeah, it's I think at first everybody was like, what's happening? What are we doing? um but I had a pretty optimistic outlook on it. um as I mentioned, the the department, the sustainability and resilience department, now division, um, isn't too old, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we were getting our feet under us. We were hiring employees. We were building programs. The last director who really started the program in Tempe um, did such a good job of getting sustainability to be at the table of the conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that being merged with transportation, while some people might think of it, oh, it lowers its prominence, so to
Mm-hmm.
say, I think it legitimized us a bit. Instead of just
Interesting. Yeah.
having plans on the bookshelf, right?
Yeah.
Which we did. We were able to say, no, here's what it looks like in the built environment.
Mm.
Here's what it looks like as infrastructure. And I think that was the
Interesting.
shift that we needed to have at the time. People, you're only going to get so many people to read your climate action plan and look
Yeah.
at the
Yeah.
graphics of it. To truly understand it, people need to touch and feel things. And I do think that being with a department that has typically built things was the right time to be paired with them. And luckily, we have a director currently who has always always lived and breathed sustainability.
Yeah.
A bike commuter,
Yeah.
appreciates natives, native landscaping, right? A big kind of natural champion of sustainability, and also a career transportation planner. And so he's really the right leader to be bridging these two divisions together. And as mentioned, finding, of course, mitigation approaches of working together.
Hmm.
We've joined the bus zero emission bus work.
Yeah.
We've been evaluating having some technical assistance on that. We're thinking about more ways of expanding our free bus route. So we've been working with them on that,
Hmm.
and also this adaptation approach. They build streetscapes. They do traffic calming work. They build multi-use paths. How
Yeah.
are we in the sustainability department getting the goals that we want to see out of those projects? How
Huh.
are we thinking about I always just call it stacking benefits.
Yeah.
Okay, if we're putting in something to slow traffic down, like a median, do we fill that median with rocks? Right? Or do we say, a median isn't the best place to capture rainwater? Why don't we push it to the sides? Because streets crown in the middle.
Yeah.
And so rainfall goes to the edges of the street. You can slow things down. You can add a planted bike lane, so to say, right? So how are
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
stacking the benefits? Here's my
Sure.
goals in my division. Here's your guys' goals. How do we make this possible? And it's been really, really fun.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's fascinating to hear you talk about it and how your work aligns because, not to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like it's a way to operationalize sustainability in like a pretty practical way.
Mm-hmm.
That would be not that you couldn't do it as an independent department or function, whatever, but it's almost like it happens more naturally when you can, when you're, side by side or in the same meetings. Right. So
Absolutely.
that's really fascinating. That's very cool. So I assume you guys are obviously then at the table for bike lanes and talking about alternative transportation as part of this too, and like the kind of mitigating the greenhouse gas emissions from automobile traffic, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Very cool. Awesome. So well, I'm glad we went down that little tangent. In prepping for this meeting, I always like to poke around people's climate action plans. So I'm one of the people that will read them. But so your latest one was adopted in 2022. Can you talk about maybe some of the elements? And obviously we've touched on, I imagine, some. But do you want to talk about maybe some of the elements that are in that plan? And then I'm curious if you guys are getting close to a time for a refresh.
Yeah. So the 2022 climate action plan is a really fun plan. And I think, the first climate action plan that we had, we called it kind of on training wheels, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the 2022 plan really felt like it was a resemblance of the work that we wanted to do. The first one was kind of like, let's get something on
paper. Yeah.
On paper, right? And so the 2022 climate action plan is broken down in 3 highlight actions. So kind of 3 priority areas. One of them is green codes and standards. So the International Green Construction Code, right? The built environment. How are we making sure everything that's being built is using the right material, oriented to cast the biggest shade for the longest periods of time, energy efficiency, water, all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. So green codes for the built environment. And then green standards really goes into that green stormwater infrastructure work that we're working on. It takes engineers, it takes public works, it takes the planning department to kind of everybody get on board to how are we building this in a new way. We've typically just gotten rid of water and now you want to keep it on site, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of engineering questions that come with that. So having these standards across the board is needed to get everybody to have 2 thumbs up on that approach. So that's green codes and standards. We then have some transportation related highlight action. Again, kind of pre-COVID, we had some really bad traffic congestion in our downtown area. And so the transportation department at the time was looking at transportation management associations and kind of trying to think about, okay, we have all of this great infrastructure, but what about this social infrastructure to get people to use this physical infrastructure that we've built, right? Yeah. If we're all coming to the downtown from these different areas, these main areas from the valley, how can we all work together to reduce the headache of congestion, use the infrastructure, the public infrastructure that exists? And so that's really what that kind of study was looking at doing. And then the last one was resilience hubs or resilience energy hubs. We are still working on that. For those that aren't as familiar with resilience hubs or resilience energy hubs, these really are kind of a grassroots emergency management approach.
Mm-hmm.
It's trusted public spaces that act as your public space, right, on day-to-day programming, but also can put on two other hats, one that operates in an emergency, whatever that emergency might be, and then another hat that operates in a recovery mode from that emergency. And so we've got a staff member building a lot of good relationships with actually our faith-based institutions. These faith-based institutions also step up in the summertime and are cooling centers.
Mm-hmm.
So a place where unhoused or anybody else can go and escape the 110 plus temperatures outside. And then the resilience energy portion of it is not only do we need that social trust and that social infrastructure to make resilience hubs work, but how are we then outfitting the building to handle an emergency? And of course, in Arizona and in Tempe, we believe that biggest risk is a power outage, whether that's, a utility levels power outage or just somebody that runs into the breaker, right? That happens often. And maybe it's shut down for 24, 48 hours. Most people can find a place to go, but that's not always the case. So how is the community center or the church down the street ready, apt to provide a cool space to be? And can we have that building outfitted to continue to pump AC and provide the cooling needs that it would be required? So those are the three highlight actions that really are outlined in the climate action plan. And then we also developed agendas, which I thought were really fun. Agendas to me are really just like our stakeholder groups. Mm-hmm. So we have a youth agenda, we have a climate justice agenda, we have a business agenda, and then we have a neighborhood agenda. And each one of, as we were creating the climate action plan, these agendas were somewhat like focus groups, right? Different kind of outreach strategies used to solicit feedback. And in that outreach, we said, pick one of the three highlight actions that resonate the most for you, or that you want to see the most improvement done on. So each one of the agendas have an association with a highlight action as well. So that's kind of a cliff notes of the climate action plan. And I think one thing just in terms of outreach and process of getting to a finalized climate action plan, and an approach we didn't take the first plan, but we did the second plan, was just how we went about engagement. And this is going to be, again, to your listeners, this is going to be common approach, but at the time was a bit revolutionary and certainly not common amongst other departments in the city. But we worked with community-based organizations, ones that looked more like the communities that we were trying to reach, and put them in the driver's seat while we hung out in the back seat, right? We said, here's some funding. What do you think this could look like? Here's kind of what we want to get back. But how do you think we should get there, right? What does that look like? What does that engagement look like to you all? And so I think in take the city taking the back seat, and these community-based organizations, these partner organizations, kind of figuring out what that looked like and figuring out the best way to approach these stakeholders, was a model that is now used pretty widespread at the city and, of course, other organizations, but at the time felt, a little risque.
Felt new at the time.
Absolutely.
Very cool. Oh, well, thanks, and we'll be sure to link. We'll link to the 2022 plan in our show notes too. Um, so I'm curious. Yeah, I do want to follow up on some of the agendas that you mentioned, but the resilience hubs. So, I just so I guess as part of the strategies, you obviously you're identifying these facilities that already exist. Is that I assume part of that also to like strengthen them and make sure that they can be resilient in the event of an emergency. And then you mentioned that there was like a recovery kind of component to a hub. And what does that kind of look like? And what's the so I'm curious about the kind of the strategy of like actually making these
Mm-hmm.
separate organizations a hub, and especially if they're not all city facilities. And then what is that recovery piece?
Yeah. So for the Resilience Hub work, we are working on a kind of a microgrid feasibility study
Mm-hmm.
where we're looking at 30 different sites and both our facilities group, the folks paying the energy bills, and then the site managers are kind of working together to do audits of the building. We have a consultant, of course, on board, an energy consultant on board, kind of looking at, okay, if this building is to get solar and battery storage, what would be needed, right?
Yeah.
Infrastructure
Yeah.
wise, engineering wise. And so there's just that kind of analysis of, okay, what does this building need to be resilient? And we're looking at first responder buildings like
Mm.
PD and fire stations. Obviously, those buildings would not bring people in to
Yeah. Yeah.
um, come to for services or anything, but we need first responders to be able to respond in any emergency. And then we have some city owned community centers that are doing, your rec programs, your arts
Mm.
programs, etc. And then we are looking at non-city owned buildings. As I mentioned before, a lot of them are faith-based. We really found that there was a very big interest in faith-based
Mm.
institutions in kind of expanding what they are to the community,
Interesting.
which felt like a really nice alignment with what we were looking for as well. So there's this kind of physical, how are we making the building more resilient, and
Mm-hmm.
what will it take to get this building to function with a microgrid on it.
Oh,
And
interesting. Yeah.
so that analysis will kind of give us a prioritization as well. Hey, these buildings are going to take a lot of work and a
Yeah.
lot
Yeah.
of money to get you where you want them. These ones are looking a little bit better, right? So that we'll probably have a draft of that report in April. Um, and really, that was a report that we wanted to have to then solicit some funding, right?
Yeah.
We would
Yeah.
have some numbers, some estimates associated with that. And ideally, we had some federal funding to go after to test out these microgrids and how they function in an emergency.
Yeah.
Um, and then to the like emergency and recovery piece of things, we have been working with our emergency manager
Mm-hmm.
who is in fire medical rescue and really trying to think about, what does an emergency look like and how can we use these facilities in a way. And it's really fun work to again flip this top down approach on its head and say,
Yeah.
okay, in an emergency, what often happens? And Dan Neely, if nobody knows who that is, Dan Neely is New Zealand and is doing phenomenal things in this space of kind of resilience hubs and asset mapping, and your residents know the needs better than the people coming in to solve this emergency. So
Yeah. Yeah.
we follow a lot of his work, and these sites are surrounded by neighborhoods, and we're just asking the questions of who's the most vulnerable in your
Mm.
neighborhood. What would you guys need in an emergency? What do you have that would benefit yourselves and your neighbors in an emergency? What would you want to know? um, where would you want to go, right? So it's just kind of asking the questions and playing out some scenarios to kind of understand where the gaps would be. I think oftentimes in emergencies, those who are able call and call and call, and
Yeah.
they get the resources, and they're not always the ones that need the resources.
Yeah.
Or
Exactly.
there's a bunch of people that want to support and are like, yes, here's the socks. You need socks? Here's socks. And the neighbor's like, we don't need socks.
Stop
Like
giving me
you've
socks. Yeah.
you've actually created more of a problem because now we don't know what to do with all these socks, right?
Yeah.
So it's really just trying to lean in to neighbor community knowledge and use these resilience hubs as a way to organize that knowledge and to better prepare them in an emergency. And
Yeah.
then they feel empowered and knowledgeable about what to ask for, who's doing what, and where to go. And then our role, right, is facilitating some of those conversations, but also how does that building physically operate for you?
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. That's really fascinating. And that's so cool to think about, like, yeah, very micro level, like planning and like resilience at like a truly like even more local than than a city, but like get down to the neighborhood of like what residents actually want and need. Um,
So local, and it's funny, people love thinking about it. People
yeah.
love to think about um the assets that they have, and oh, we'll need to take care of uh little old lady Miss
Yeah.
down the
Yeah.
street, right? Like, and her pets, right? Like, we know she loves her pets. Like, we would need her pets to go somewhere, and she has a medication that's refrigerated. Like, what
Hmm.
would that look like, right? So
Yeah.
um it's a really beautiful thing when you start to give the microphone over to the community and have them think about how they want to function and operate, and what the gaps are in their
Yeah.
knowledge, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's pretty cool work.
That's really cool. Um, well, then there were a couple other. So you mentioned the agenda groups, and I'm curious to hear more about kind of the both the youth engagement, like what that's looked like, and kind of the feedback you've gotten from that community, and then you mentioned climate justice, and
Mm.
I think your plan mentions that, and equity, and I'm curious how you guys are thinking about that work as part of your plan too.
Sure. So the youth agenda was fun. They really called out transportation and food.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, I love it. That makes so much sense. I always think about the youth agenda and a kid walking to school in a shaded area and like being able to pick their breakfast on the way to school, right? Or like a citrus as part of their lunch. Like, when I think about the youth agenda, that's what I think about. Um, and so it really is. They had a lot of interest around better transportation access, and we're hearing that from um, youth nationally, right? They
Yeah.
want to live in walkable cities, and I think that's continuing to be a trend. They want bike paths that feel safe. They want to make sure they're not sweating their butts off before they get to school, and they have this really cool, fun interest in local food.
Yeah.
Um, they want public programs at their school. They want public programs at their community centers. They want to learn more about it. They care about food waste. They want the opportunity to pick their produce and take it into their culinary class. So we've been working on some of that programming with some grants, and we have a youth climate action coordinator in our office developing strong relationships with not only the youth but the teachers the school administrators, the board officials. It really does take relationship building at all of the levels.
Yeah.
Schools can be very difficult to work with.
Yeah.
Because of the lack of resources that they have.
Hmm.
And they're dealing with children and youth. And so they have a big responsibility and a lot of um, safety and precautions that sometimes is hard to cut through.
Yeah.
um, so that's the youth agenda. They definitely picked the green codes and standards as their highlight action,
Hmm.
because they're like, yeah, if we're doing green infrastructure or green stormwater infrastructure, you can layer food into that. It creates a cooler environment. They saw the benefits to their transportation pathways being benefited by green codes and standards.
Cool.
Um, and then the climate justice agenda was developed with a community based organization called Unlimited Potential.
Hmm.
They've been around in the Valley doing work for a long time, really trusted by the community. They have some public health workers as part of their staff. So, what we heard from the climate justice agenda was fears, concerns about extreme heat and energy equity. We know that cities' zoning practices have not always been beneficial to all residents everywhere, and that
Hmm.
certain neighborhoods are just more hot,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yep.
they're next to a freeway, they're surrounded by freeway, they have less parks. Um, the infrastructure or the lack of infrastructure has led to physically hotter daytime temperatures,
Yeah.
more um, impervious or hardscape surfaces. And so that then, that also usually connects with homes that are a little bit older, not as energy efficient, not as well insulated. And so they are left paying higher energy bills, right?
Hmm.
And experiencing less cool homes, even though they're pumping out this maybe same AC as the person in the other neighborhood. It's just a efficiency matter.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, in 2023, uh, Maricopa County had 645 deaths, heat related deaths,
Wow. Yeah.
and of the 645, 160 of them were indoor heat related deaths.
Wow. Hmm.
And so we look at that number and we believe it is the city of Tempe's role to say everybody deserves to cool their home.
Yeah. Yeah.
If we have an indoor death, we think that is 100% preventable, right? And indoor deaths, of the 161 indoor deaths, 141 of them um, had an AC unit, right? There was an AC unit in the dwelling, but what can we assume or what can we infer about
Hmm.
that? One, the AC unit was not working well, and two is they these individuals didn't want to use it, right? they
Yeah.
they were spread too thin to crank the AC. They weren't willing to pay for using the AC. So we out of the climate justice agenda, um, I have a wonderful staff member who basically took this information and did a focus group in our most heat vulnerable neighborhoods.
Hmm.
So we have the data to back up who are those that have the demographics that are just typically more vulnerable, right? Lower income, um, uh, um, lower educated, rely on public transportation, and we paired that demographic data with the areas that physically are the hottest.
Mm.
And so we call them heat vulnerable areas. And we did 8 months, once a month, a focus group where we paid these individuals to come and learn
Yeah.
about energy, um, and also then, we co-created a energy equity roadmap.
Huh. Yeah.
So this is, again, specifically looking at the goal that everybody should be able to afford to cool their homes, and that there is things that the city can do education programmatic wise. There's things that we should be advocating for at the state and federal level. There are energy efficiencies that we should be helping people navigate.
Mm.
And there are things that we should be doing for building codes and the built environment and the neighborhood level, that goes into like the urban cooling stuff, right? How are we creating a cooler outside to benefit the inside?
Yeah.
So we have the energy equity roadmap going to council next week, Monday, actually,
cool.
for approval.
Yeah. That's awesome. So we'll have to keep an ie out for that. And,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, very cool. Well, this has been fascinating. I really appreciate you kind of covering all this. So I know we're a little over time, but just before we wrap up, what's next? What are things that you're working on that our listeners ought to look out for? Obviously, there's this energy equity roadmap that hopefully is published and accepted before this episode comes out, so we can add it to the notes. But otherwise, folks can keep an eye out. But what else are you working on that our listeners ought to look out for?
Yeah, so definitely the energy equity roadmap, and some of this green stormwater infrastructure work is coming to light as well. We call it the Rain to Roots program. Most people don't really know what green stormwater infrastructure is. So we did Rain to Roots instead. And I'm working on developing an urban cooling performance measure. Again, it's kind of going beyond the tree and shade canopy. That's going to be an input, certainly. But if we really want to look at urban cooling, we have to go beyond just adding trees and shade. It does require other strategies. And so what does that look like in terms of albedo and having reflective material? What does that look like in terms of removing hardscape and that cultural shift around that? And that goes to built environment and private code requirements. And then, of course, it's how are we dealing with water when we do have water and rainfall? How are we choosing the right vegetation that will survive and thrive in this area? So be on the lookout for an urban cooling kind of data set matrix performance measure that I can't seem to find anywhere else. So I am really freewheeling it.
I love it. Well, awesome. Well, and then the last question is always the hardest. If you could be the Gov Love DJ and pick the exit music for this episode, what song would you pick?
Oh, I have a favorite song right now. It's so good. Dierks Bentley. He is a country artist that actually grew up in Arizona. It's a song called Something Real. And it's just really hits home, I think, for everybody who struggles sometimes with all of the news and not understanding what's real and what's not, feeling like they need to be more authentic in their life. It's been my go-to song riding into work, reminding myself to be real and hold on to my values and my principles and do the work that feels really right to me and in a way that feels really right to me. So Dierks Bentley, Something Real.
I love that. I love that. That's a great sentiment, and we'll get that queued up in this to end the episode. So that ends our episode for today. Brianne, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me and sharing your work. This has been really fun.
Thank you so much for asking. I really appreciate the opportunity to highlight Tempe and our work, and I'm so appreciative of all of the other episodes you've had and all of the knowledge that you're capturing for everybody.
Yeah, of course. And for our listeners, GovLove is brought to you by Engaging Local Government Leaders. The best way to support this podcast is to become an ELGL member. You can reach us online at elgl.org/GovLove or on LinkedIn at our GovLove podcast page. And if you're not already, please subscribe to GovLove on your favorite podcast app. And then go tell a friend, a colleague, a neighbor, a friend, an enemy about this podcast. Help us spread the word that GovLove is the go-to place for local government stories. With that, thank you for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.
I want to climb up on a mountain. I want love that feels like home. Yeah, I want a conversation like a sunset and a song I can feel down in my bones. Yeah, I need a little backbone in my backbeat. I need a little lifelong in my front seat. I need the kind of moments that make my whole wide world stand still. I wanna hear about a deep cut, a heartbreak. Yeah, tell me about your hard times, your mistakes. Give me something that'll burn, I can turn into something I can feel. Yeah, I want something real strong. Yeah, something I can hold on to. When the red dirt settles down and there's nothing left around, I'm just looking for some truth. I'm just looking for some truth. I need a little backbone in my backbeat. I need a little lifelong in my front seat.